Hello and welcome to another season, a reboot of Roaster School here at Mill City Roasters. I'm Joe Marrocco and I'm going to take you through a whole new season of a bunch of new information that also goes back and revisits some of the old information on the roaster schools that we have already covered. And with me here today is our founder, Steve Green.
'Tis I, Steve Green.
Steve and I are going to take episode 1 and we're going to dive into what a roasting machine is, what we do here at Mill City, and some tips and tricks into how to use this roaster well. And Steve, as the owner here and as the founder of not only Mill City Roasters, but also you're funding the roaster school, you're putting out all this information for free.
Wait a minute, this is free?
Well, it's free for them.
Get the hell out of here.
It's not free for you.
Pony up.
So what are some of your goals in putting this out there to the world? What are you hoping to get out of it this year?
Okay, so, we started early on with you and Dave on video.
That's right.
Because people would get their brand new shiny roaster, and sadly, it was broken because their coffee was terrible. So what we did was we asked Dave and Joe to come online and kind of guide you through the roasting process a little bit to get better results. And since we've sold so many more new roasters to so many new brilliant people, we're now going to continue this in a little more structured fashion.
Yeah, we're going to
correct all your past mistakes.
Exactly. This is like that opportunity that rarely comes where you get to watch yourself in video and all of the torture that brings you, you can go back and fix. I get that opportunity today, so this is pretty great for me too. So probably next year we'll go back and revisit these.
More than likely, yes.
So just to get us started into this season, we're going to start very basic. And I want you to take a moment and talk about the physical roasting machine, what it is, what are some of the, working parts of it, and then we're going to build up from there and learn about how to use it best.
Okay, so here's how this works. A commercial coffee roaster is usually a rotating drum and a heat source and some airflow to pass heat and energy to the seed. Now, there's a lot of different ways to do that, and there's a lot of different approaches, but we think that we've kind of found a way to make that a little better for most people.
That's right. Yeah, and that heat delivery affects the seed in a couple of different ways. Talk a little bit about the different kinds of heat that we are using to cook the coffee. Okay,
so we've got convection heating, which is the coffee is surrounded by heated air. And we've got conduction, which is bean to bean and bean to drum, the inside of the drum. Now, one of the things that's interesting about commercial coffee roasters is one would think with a rotating drum that you would have a much higher level of conduction in the drum, but it turns out, so conduction is point-to-point contact on the seed, and it's the most efficient transfer of heat energy from the machinery to the coffee itself, but it's only at one tiny little point. So as the drum rotates, we mechanically fluidize the bean mass. Now, I know a lot of people talk about fluid bed roasters as air roasters, but even your drum roaster is 70% air heat.
Correct.
Right?
Yep, definitely.
So as we rotate the drum, the vanes inside kind of tractor the coffee back and forth on the bottom of the drum, and the inner vanes tractor it back. So every single seed should ideally pass through every portion of the drum, which is super important because your drum is hotter at the top and cooler at the bottom. So a lot of people think that, hey, it should all be the same temperature, kind of like an oven. Well, those people obviously have never baked a cake at the top of the oven. Doesn't work, right? So there's a lot of analogies towards cooking here. Yeah. And I think you mentioned that a lot, even though it kind of makes me cringe sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, it is a type of cooking. Roasting is a style of cooking something. So thinking about it from a culinary perspective, I think gives us a little bit of gives us an ability to kind of sit back and think about drawing flavor out of the seed.
Right. And it's obviously, well, maybe it's not obvious to everybody, but it's obvious to us that roasting is a sensory-driven process.
Absolutely.
So, absent that sensory data, it's only temperature over time. That is literally just putting the cake in the oven and letting it sit. We're not baking coffee, we're roasting coffee for a specific purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely.
we apply heat very specifically.
So speaking of applying heat very specifically, one of the coolest things I think about the Mill City roaster systems is the controls that you have added to the machines. I know machines that I used to roast on, we would have gas control, and that was basically it. We would have gas control, maybe gas control. So.
Well, now remember back in the day, a commercial coffee roaster was really designed for a single batch size at a single roast level, right? So you would stuff 20 kilograms into the drum and let it cook away for 20 minutes and bag it up and send it to the local gas station. Well, that was great, but the market has moved on a little bit. So when we started optimizing the platform for specialty coffee, we wanted to make sure that we gave as much information as possible to the roaster as a standard thing. It was like we don't think thermocouples for roast logging should be optional. That's kind of an important thing, right? Unless you're doing maybe gas station coffee.
True.
I don't know, maybe not. But we also, recognize that people use the machinery in different ways from what maybe the designer had originally intended.
Absolutely true.
The market's moved on. We're looking for different things. And we know more about coffee now. So the old clunky pre-World War II probats that most of us learned on are great, but they're a much more difficult system to kind of game for maximum roast quality.
Yeah, and we also have a lot of different styles of coffee today that are going into the drum. People are wanting to tweak out different batch sizes even on the same drum. So there are a lot of variables that are at play, and that information that's coming from the system needs to not just be information, but it needs to be controllable.
That's a really good point. So one of the things that's super interesting about the evolution of the industry just in the 10 years I've been screwing around here is that we have so many more good coffees.
Thank God.
Remember a couple of years ago, maybe you'd have, a handful of truly epically great Costa Rican micro lots. And now they're almost innumerable, or even different areas of the world. Yunnan, for instance, some of the coffee that comes out of Yunnan is pretty great.
Yeah.
But those seeds are small and those varieties are different, and they roast different. They take energy differently. It's a pretty good idea to have a platform that you can tailor for that maximum flavor benefit at the end of the roast.
Absolutely. And some of the controls that you have added on are, well, obviously you have fuel adjustments still in place, but you also have
That
air
seemed like
adjustment.
a good idea.
Yeah, definitely. You got to keep what's not broke, and then add things to make it even better. So you've added air adjustment. Talk to me about that control.
We do VFD. We run 3-phase fans. We convert single-phase power to through VFD drives, and it gives us speed control over our fan speed. So there's no detents. I don't decide what your airflow is supposed to be. You decide what your airflow is supposed to be. And then we added the Magnahelic drum pressure gauges as a visual indication of airflow, which before we were screwing around with lighters and we were trying to figure that out. And we still do that, to make sense a little bit better of the information we get off the Magnahelics. But once we kind of calibrate to what's going on in that drum, then we can go back to the Magnahelic and use that to very precisely control airflow.
That's right. And speaking of the drum, you also have control over that.
We have variable drum speed. Now, listen, we want to be clear. None of this stuff is like an automatic killer app guarantee of better coffee. As a matter of fact,
I was so excited.
The truth is, on some level, and I'm just going to say this, it's almost more opportunity to fail.
Yeah, it can be.
If you haven't watched this video, right?
That's why we're here.
I mean, that's literally why we're here. There's a lot of control here. It's not immediately intuitively obvious that sometimes you turn up airflow and you get more heat, and other times you turn up airflow and you get less heat. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to teach you how to manage that in the same exact way we do in our classes here at the campus.
Yeah, and the number one heat that you really want to manage, in my opinion, is the heat of the coffee itself, which on our curve here, you can see this starkly white line. That's what we call the bean temperature. That bean temperature is being read out by a probe that is kind of put, well, I guess you could tell me more about bean temperature and the probe.
I have a prop.
Oh, you happen to bring a probe. Someone prepared for today.
Ta-da. Okay, so this is a thermocouple. All this is 2 pieces of wire in a stainless steel sheath.
Okay.
That's all it is. Now, the wire is pretty exotic, you know, relative to lamp cord, right?
Everybody says that.
And it's welded, and as the temperature goes up, it produces a tiny little current, which would be, dare I say it?
Oh, please go for it. Let's get nerdy here.
41 times 10 to the negative 6th, was it microvolts, I think it is? Per degree centigrade,
correct, yep.
right? So it's kind of interesting that what we do, the way that we use this, for those of you who don't know, we drill a hole in the roaster, right? Kind of a trepanation process. You can look that up on Wikipedia. We drill a hole in the roaster and we insert the probe. The bean temperature probe, what this line represents over time, is placed as low into the drum as we can possibly get it, where it's less affected by airflow around the drum gap, and on the side of the drum where the beans pile up. So it gives us a more reliable indication of what's going on in that bean mass at any given point in time.
That's right, yeah. So since our drums are rotating clockwise, I'm sorry, for you, I guess it's this way on my end. As the drum is rotating, the beans are piling up over here. So we'll show you a picture here. There, now you can see it.
On your roaster, you can typically, usually, but not always, the bean mass is going to pile on the side with a trier. There are some glaring exceptions to that, where maybe the engineer didn't know what they were trying to catch in the drum. I'm trying to catch flies in my drum. Yeah, maybe not.
So not only do we have a bean temperature probe, but we also have an environmental temperature probe. The environmental temperature probe reads on this higher line. That's a little harder to see on our chart here, but that higher line.
I can see it fine.
Okay, great. That higher line is measuring the air in the space in the drum. Where do you put that probe generally?
Where the beans aren't.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right? So on our machines, the bean temperature is in the lower left-hand quadrant, and the environmental temperature, or the ET, is in the upper right-hand quadrant.
That's excellent. A lot of roasters out there don't have the environmental temperature probe put into the face of the drum. Instead, they'll have what is called an exhaust temperature probe. On our larger models, we do use an exhaust temperature probe, but that's usually an analog
Honestly,
thermocouple.
That's mostly just for cosmetic. I like the way it looks.
Because your coffee's roasting in the drum, not in your exhaust system, so we want to measure that space.
It's okay. There's no problem with running a thermocouple in your exhaust temp. That's the air that exits the drum anyway. It's fine. But here's the takeaway here. The speed at which this roast progresses is directly proportionate to the distance on your graph between these 2 lines, right?
That's a huge tip, by the way, a huge trick.
Huge trick.
It is.
So the farther this gap is, you can see, you can look online, you can probably download this as a PDF someplace, right? Wherever this gap is wider, this slope is steeper.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
One kind of pulls on the other, and that air is what's delivering your heat. So as it delivers the heat to the beans, it pulls the beans up to match its own temperature.
And if you think of it in terms of the thermocouple in the exhaust stream, it doesn't really matter. It's relative reference. That represents the energy that wasn't imparted in the seed. The more energy that's in the exhaust, the more energy is actually being imparted into the seed.
That's exactly right. And speaking of energy in the exhaust, you do the inverse of that too, with energy that is going into the drum with an inlet air temperature probe.
Yeah, the inlet air temperature probe measures the energy going into the drum, the potential energy that can heat the drum and heat the seed. So one of the really interesting ways that a guy can use that is at any given gas setting. Remember, we talked about your roaster being somewhere along the lines of 30% conductive, 30% convective. You can achieve maximum convective energy by increasing your airflow until the temperature reaches its apogee. The maximum temperature of your incoming air at any given gas level is going to represent the maximum amount of energy that you can impart into the seed at that gas level.
That's exactly right, yeah.
That can be very useful for big batch sizes with aggressive profiles.
That's right. So I'm going to kind of repeat that in a different way, if that's cool with you.
Please do.
So in other words, while you turn your air up in your exhaust fan up, the gas that you have at its max will only heat so much air. So we have overbuilt the fan so much on these machines that you can turn your air up so high that then you're bringing in a volume of air that fuel is no longer able to heat, and now you're bringing in more cool air, which drops the temperature. But by looking at that inlet air temperature, you can find where your max gas plus your max air is, which is your max amount of convection.
Exactly.
That's excellent.
Super cool, huh?
Yeah, and then you have a fourth temperature probe, which we like to call generally the PID temperature because it shows up on a PID readout on your control panel. Tell me about that.
The temperature controller on the machine is an over temperature limit switch. All that is a safety device. So if your roaster gets above, in our case, 445 degrees, it shuts the gas off. Bang. That's it. End of roasting, right? Typically on our machines, that's about 35 to 40 seconds deep into rolling second crack. So that's very, very deep in the roast level. Those beans are at that point, they're definitely oily and they're definitely getting blacker by the second. It's not coffee that most of us want to drink. So that's where we set that over temperature limit. Now the reason that we put the temperature controller kind of as close to the center line of the drum as possible is because I feel like that is the best possible position where that probe is least affected by airflow.
That makes a lot of sense.
It is also the reason that we very highly recommend that people preheat their drum to the temperature controller temperature.
Yeah, and we're going to talk in our next video about charge temperatures, but generally this is what we would recommend for you to use for that charge temperature instead of the bean temp, which is way down low in the drum,
Right.
maybe getting affected by air coming through the drum gap.
Absolutely.
Or your environmental temperature, which is gathering so much more energy from your exhaust.
And look, I don't have a dog in the fight. If you've got a protocol that works for you and you want to charge on your environmental temperature, that's fine. Based on my experience roasting, I think it's far preferable to use the temperature controller on the roaster.
Yeah, it's going to be the one that is the most stable for sure.
I think so.
Yep, absolutely. All right, so in looking at the profile curve that I have here, I want to be very clear and say, this is not a magic profile.
What?
I'm sorry. I know everybody out there
I paid for this.
was jotting this down. This is just a generic profile to use as a visual aid. There's no such thing as a magic profile. As a matter of fact,
Wait a minute now.
if I send you a profile and you put that into your system and try to roast that curve, you'll probably come up with something that tastes very different. Why is that?
Well, there's a couple reasons. First one is thermocouples are different. Their placement is different. A thinner thermocouple with a lighter sheath will react much quicker than a heavier thermocouple with a heavier sheath. So what will happen is at our turning point, which you're going to cover in depth later, the thinner thermocouple have a much lower turning point, and mathematically your software is going to calculate a much higher rate of rise. If you're not on exactly the same machine, the same environmental conditions, the same batch size, the same drum speed, the same everything, your coffee is going to behave dramatically differently. Roasting, let me be very clear, is a sensory-driven process. The only thing that this does for you is it puts into context how you got to those sensory cues.
Yep.
How did I get to green to yellow transition? How did I get from drying hay to something like a baking muffin? How did I get from silence, right, to first crack? Pop, 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 pop. Or what is my scent in my trier indicates a certain amount of development after first crack. These are all things that you are going to interpret, and they're kind of a roadmap to get you back to repeat that process time after time after time. It also shows you that if you get to the cupping table and you went off the rails and your coffee is awful, well, then you know that maybe I need to change some way that I handled that roast.
So to give you all a little historical context, when I started roasting, we did not have charts like this.
Right.
We would basically adjust the gas. We would sit there and write down time, temp, time, temp, time, temp.
And calculate every 30 seconds.
Exactly. And we would try to like hustle in and get a try on the trier and then mark that down. Some people would even mark down all of their aromatic experiences that they could chart.
Which was smart.
And that's how we roasted coffee. Well, once this came up, or once this kind of technology started becoming more available, this was not something that most roasters that were roasting during that time began to pay really close attention to. This freed them up to pay attention to the coffee. So we could put down our clipboards and actually use the trier and then revisit what we had done.
So here's just to put that a little further into context. So back in the day, when everybody was doing this and they were writing everything down, there were some fantastic roasters, right? There were guys that really knew their business and really got great coffee time after time after time after time.
Yep.
Those guys were awesome. The problem was more people are roasting coffee now. And what this is it's an aid to develop your craft. So a lot of times you guys think of this thing as like an aid to develop better coffee. Well, yeah, that's part of it. But what this really is an aid to help you learn how to roast better.
That's right.
This doesn't replace anything. And there's no computer. I know, I'm sorry, I hate to, I'm gonna tip over a sacred cow, right? There's no computer, there's no automation thing that's gonna do this for you. Somebody has to program that machine, and they actually have to be around your coffee. So like if somebody says, oh, well, so-and-so says you should handle this like this. Okay, well, is he gonna come in and cup with me? Probably not.
Is he going to buy your coffee?
Probably not. Right? Speaking of buying coffee, let me just mention, I'm wearing a push-pull t-shirt from our good friends Push-Pull in Portland, Oregon. Feel free to send me all the swag you want, and I'll wear it on camera and make you famous.
Same. I'll take that too.
I don't know why you hadn't thought of that. If I'm going to be here, I want the t-shirt, okay?
Thanks for the clipboard, Steve.
Yeah.
Well, I think that kind of wraps us up for today. We have...
Extra large, by the way.
We've covered the parts of the roaster. We've covered the temperature probes and how they work. And we've covered how they kind of read out. So if you feel like you need to revisit this video, please watch us again and come back for the next episode where we're going to dig deeper into this chart and what this chart means and get into the first part of that roast. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and good night.